So I'm going to turn the floor over to Tom Wells here in a second. I'm going to do a brief introduction. He has a long history here at Weatherford College. He built the foundation that social sciences is operating on today, quite frankly. So we owe a debt to him. So a little bit of information about Tom. A BA from Howard Payne College in 1971. Got his Master of Arts in Teaching from Tarleton in 1973. So local guy. Began teaching at Weatherford College as an adjunct in 1978, which is remarkable. Taught at Granbury High School from 1982 to 1983. Joined, say again? 93, forgive me. And then joined the full-time faculty at Weatherford College in 1993 when I was 9 years old. Yeah, just to put that in perspective. Yeah, all right. And retired in 2021, an esteemed faculty member here in the former chair. We are happy to have him back for our October meeting of the lecture series. And Professor Wells, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, my friend.
Thank you. Actually, that comes at the other end. This is going to be about what I call the Great Screwed Up Election of 1824. 200 years ago next year. It's in some somewhat ominous ways, it's unique among American presidential elections. We're going to see why that was. But the election itself won't take very long. I've set up some context because in a larger sense, this is about why we elect the president and vice president the way we do, what the system was originally designed to be, how it didn't really work out well. By 1804, we had the only constitutional level change in that system. Excuse me. And what political parties do for us. Working that in as well. Okay. The Constitution writers did not anticipate that there would be political parties. They didn't anticipate even that there would be candidates, let alone nominees. So they had agreed that there would be a single chief executive to be called the President of the United States, that this person would serve a 4-year term with no limit on the election. The term limit we have now only dates from 1951. Okay. So then they faced the perplexing problem of how to choose someone to fill this office. And they, in preliminary sense, agreed on and backed off from the two things we would consider most obvious. Why don't we just have an election? What if you'd met your first class this fall? First class, all right? Teacher comes in, hands everybody a blank 3x5 note card and says, we're going to elect a student body president. You just write down on there the name of anybody you think might be good. Would that work? No. Well, that's what they're up against. The other thing was have the Congress elect the president and vice president. That might not have been quite such a leap because that's basically how they did it in Britain. But they wanted the executive and legislative to be co-equal. If the president is chosen by the Congress, he is answerable to the Congress. He would be, as one delegate put it, under the Congress's thumb. Not good. So what they came up with was an odd system which is intended to choose a president and a vice president in the absence of candidates or nominees or anything like that. We call it the Electoral College. Those words do not appear in the Constitution. In one sense of the word college is not something that has a football team with an English department. It's a group of dignitaries with some high-level official purpose. Each state, every 4 years, selects a number of electors, that's Constitution speak for voters, equal in number to its representation in Congress, however many Congress seats it has, the number of senators. Adding electors for the senators gives the small states a little extra clout. So if you're worried about how we should get rid of the Electoral College, find something else to worry about. It would take an amendment, which would be, frankly, impossible. Right? Anyway, if you are an elected official, you're ineligible to serve as an elector. It has to be private citizens. All right? These people would meet in their states on an appointed day, and each one of them, this is the original system now, each one would cast votes for 2 different persons for president. The idea being these are the ones that kind of know who's out there, who's available, who might be good at it. So each one would vote for 2 different persons for president. There's not a separate election for vice president. They seal these ballots up, send them to Congress, which meets in joint session. That's where the House and Senate meet together. It's not where they're token up back in the cloakroom. Sorry about that. You understood. Anyway, they would count the president of the Senate resigns, and whoever gets the most votes is the president, as long as it's a majority of the total number of electors. Whoever gets the second most votes, should anybody pull that one off, they get to be the vice president. Or they then get a letter in the mail informing them that they've been chosen and requesting the courtesy of a prompt reply to whether they would accept it or not. Well, there you go. This worked as designed twice. The first and second elections, George Washington was unanimously chosen. No one else ever has been. There was a close call on that. Anyway, they were not quite in such common agreement on vice president, but that went to John Adams of Massachusetts. And for the next 60 years or so, check it out, there's always a northerner and a southerner, okay, in those offices. Now, by 1796, the third election, the end of Washington's second term, two gestational political parties were beginning to emerge. There were controversies, they always grew out of controversies. Alexander Hamilton's controversial financial proposals was part of it. Our response to the extremely bloody and violent French Revolution was another part of it, because most people were horrified by the bloodletting of the French Revolution. They reached a point where you get your head chopped off if somebody heard you complaining about the price of bread. I'm serious. But there were still some Americans who favored the French Revolution. So if we elect them, you really bet your life they're not going to set up a guillotine, chop your head off. Well, it was fear-driven. The politics of the 1790s were extremely, extremely toxic, bordering on violence. But we have a contested election in 1796. These two, you start out as bodies of opinion that gradually start to get organized. They took names. They claimed names. The Federalists, whom Washington tended to support, is our only officially nonpartisan president. The Federalists opposed the French Revolution, generally favored a stronger central government. They rallied around Vice President John Adams and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who was not eligible to be president, being foreign born. Those two men didn't have any use for each other either, but they were in a way, the leaders. The other party rallied around Thomas Jefferson. They took the name Democratic Republicans. That's the name of both our political parties today. After a while, they're writing with, Deborah Quill, an inkwell. How many times you have to do that to write Democratic Republican? They shortened it to just Republicans. They're not the Republicans of today, oddly enough. They are the institutional ancestors of today's Democrats. Well, and they favored smaller government, lower taxes. You never can tell. All right, so we have a contested election. There were no primaries, there's no convention. Federalist leaders would communicate by mail, and they basically decided that John Adams, the vice president, would be their nominee. They weren't in quite such complete agreement on who their other nominee would be. There's not a separate election anyway. The Democratic Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. All right. Adams won, 71 to 68. So all we have is the electoral vote. So Adams won in the first contested election. Okay, controversies continued, and then let me see. Okay. Skipping some stuff here. That's going to bring us to the great screwed up election of 1800. One odd thing about the election of 96, I'm leaving something out. I haven't done this in 3.5 years. It might be a tad rusty. Adams won in the Electoral College, of course, but the Federalist electors were kind of scattered out on who the vice president would be, and Thomas Jefferson came in second, so he got to be the vice president. Ever had another election like that where one party's nominee is to be president and the other party's nominee vice president? Now, Adams and Jefferson, for years, they knew each other, they'd been allies, they worked together, diplomats in Europe. Their friendship is going to end. They're going to be deeply and bitterly estranged for the time being. So, the election of 1800 came around, it's a rematch. Adams, the incumbent president versus the incumbent vice president. And things are getting more serious. 1796 style mudslinging was when the president of Yale University referred to the Democratic Republicans as fire-eating salamanders, poison-sucking toads. Cover your ears, Penelope. By 1800, there were people hiding their Bibles in case Jefferson won, thought to be incorrectly to be an atheist. He'd send the government men around to take up all the Bibles and burn them in a big bonfire. They were afraid that he would import the horrors of the French Revolution to America. The word had got out of former fiction writer who invented malicious falsehoods about Jefferson's opponents. Had a pay dispute with Jefferson, and he wrote the story about Sally Hemings. Jefferson had a thing going on with one of his slave women, and we now know, yeah, he did. Okay. That seemed unseemly. Nonetheless, Jefferson won our first contested election. But not quite so fast. Here's why it's screwed up. The way you get your number one guy in number one and your number two guy in number two is that all your electors vote for your number one guy. One designated elector throws away the second vote. Okay? So the Federalists ran the play as diagrammed. Adams got 65 votes, and his running mate, Mr. Pinckney from South Carolina, got 64. In the Democratic Republican side, however, whoever was supposed to throw away the second vote didn't get the memo. So Jefferson got 73 electoral votes, and so did Aaron Burr. Now remember, they weren't voting for Burr for vice president. Technically, they're voting for two different people for president. It's a tie. That meant the House of Representatives would carry out what is known as a contingent election. And the way it was originally set up, if no one gets a majority of the electoral vote, the House would choose among the top 5 electoral vote getters. We've never had 5 electoral vote getters. And speaking of which, I happen to think that the Constitution writers probably weren't under any illusion that anybody would usually get a majority. The way this would work going forward is that the electors would forward to the House of Representatives a list of 5 choices to choose among. Okay, but if it's a tie, they can only break the tie. They're the only ones that they can vote for. And the House of Representatives was controlled still by Federalists who had lost their re-election bids, but their terms weren't over. And there were some of them who would have voted for Satan hot from hell before they would have voted for Thomas Jefferson. In fact, they couldn't tell the difference. And the House voted inconclusively 35 times. With Inauguration Day, March 4th, drawing closer by the day, gotta pick somebody. That resonates today, doesn't it? Sorry about that. Finally, a couple of these crusty old Federalists were persuaded just to stay in their hotel rooms and not go down to the Capitol. These, by the way, were the first really big events to take place in our Capitol building. Washington was a new city, and that let the election fall to Jefferson. The way it worked out, there's 16 states, takes a majority to win. They're voting by states, each state one vote. They would still be that way if it happened again. There were 8 for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, and 2 where the delegation was evenly split, hence they could not cast a vote. Now, there were Federalists voting for Burr. They didn't know that much about him. They didn't know that he was a conscience-free opportunist. And they were projecting their fantasies upon him. People tend to do that even today. All right, so Jefferson gets to be elected. By 1804, the only Constitution-level adjustment in the system had been made. The 12th Amendment states that the electors will meet and vote for one person for president and another person for vice president. That's it. The only other things constitutionally is that there are 3 amendments that prohibit states from using certain things to prohibit citizens from voting. Okay. All right. I have a cheat sheet here. The elections of 1804 through 1816 were contested elections with a Federalist nominee versus a Republican nominee, okay? The election of 1808 has a little bit of extra behind-the-scenes significance. For the first time, there was a somewhat systematic way of agreeing on candidates. The Democratic Republicans, I don't know about the Federalists, Democratic Republicans, all their members of Congress, just members of Congress, House and Senate, that were Republicans, met together, agreed upon their nominees. So that's a step toward having, and it was closed, you know. Regular citizens, regular people had no input on it. Okay. I'll have to be in flashback for a minute. James Monroe, the 5th president, James Monroe, and the 4th Virginian out of 5, won the election of 1816 handily. And after that, the Federalists just faded off the scene. You still had Federalists, but they ceased to be a force in national politics. They never nominated a candidate again after that. Monroe's 2 terms are sometimes called, in the expression days of the time, the era of good feelings. Sounds like fun. The late teens 2 centuries ago were among the most optimistic times in our whole history. Okay, if it's 1817 and you're the age I am now, I'm not going to tell you, all you could remember in your whole life had been wars and discord and uprisings and discord, and just constant. But 1816, we have won the War of 1812, which has something I can come back to, and that's over. The West is open. We have no more natural predators. The economy is prospering. The grass is green. The flowers are blooming. The birds are singing. Very unusual time. As long as we're all making money, as long as we're prosperous. That's not going to last. When does it ever? Meanwhile, we fought a second war with Britain. In 1812, we declared war on Britain. For both stated and unstated reasons, we had causes that we put down on paper, but really what we wanted to do, we thought this is our chance to get Canada. Because the Brits are tied down fighting Napoleon, they won't be able to keep us from doing that. So it seemed like. So what started out as this optimistic war that would only be a matter of marching, they thought. By 2 years later, we're just hanging on, hoping to keep our borders intact, hoping to keep our independence. So the war had been a downer. And then, precisely 2 weeks after a treaty was signed ending the war, restoring what they called the status quo ante bellum, which is Latin for the way things were before the war. A battle was fought south of New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans. And the story of the battle grows in the telling, but the thing is, it was this totally out of the blue, unexpected, beat-down victory over the most skilled and experienced British army they could put in the field. They had landed south of New Orleans. They're going to take that city, see how much Mississippi River Valley stuff they could capture as a bargaining chip in the negotiations. Well, a makeshift army put together by Andrew Jackson, firing from behind heavily reinforced parapets, blew away something like 2,000 British soldiers, most of them wounded, some dead, and a bunch of them just laying on the ground, as a prudent man would do. What do you think? Well, this was a bolt of lightning, okay? It gave us the false impression we had won the war when we had achieved neither our stated nor our unstated objectives. And it turned Jackson into a political superhero with a stature almost rivaling that of Washington himself. And it made us enthusiastic USA nationalists for the first time. Even coming out of the Revolution, people's identity, their primary political identity was with their state. Like the old Articles of Confederation, it was the Union. It was 13 independent countries, more or less, united. So we became very enthusiastically nationalistic for the first time. So file that one away. Also, this is going to go away. all right, things never stay the way they are somehow. In 1819, we had a serious financial downturn. I'm not sure how many, but we had 5 depressions in the 19th century. We didn't call them that, called them panics. But the economy hit serious problems in 1819. This is huge because, for one thing, it's the 2 before upside the head. There are a lot of people out there for whom the federal government had always been remote and bordering on irrelevance, to being where its policies could affect us. So Northerners, Southerners, and Westerners, North, South, West. West was a unique section at the time. They're after their congressman to try to get some policy change that would help them. What came out of this was the realization that there was no one single thing the federal government could do that would help everybody. What would help the North would hurt the South and the West. What would help the West would hurt the North and the South. You see what I'm saying? Eventually the West will fracture along North-South lines. We're not there yet. Okay. North, South, and West begin to see that they have unique financial interests which roll over into political interests, and that they're at variance with each other. Another thing going on, in fact, out of the Panic of 1819, sometimes it's credited with this, there was a groundswell demand for the system to be made more open and more democratic than it was originally set up to be, to allow more people to vote. And mainly this took the form of 2 things that were not new, that were just long in coming. For one thing, all 13 of the original states had laws that you had to be a property owner in order to vote. Okay, what was that about? The rationale was that if you own property, you don't have a boss. You're a free agent. You can cast a free vote. If you don't have property, you're probably working for somebody, and the person you're working for, since the idea of the ballot being confidential lies a century in the future, almost, he can check on you, see how you voted. If you don't vote for Dustin, so don't bother coming in tomorrow. So it gives employers extra votes in a way. What I mean here is that only property owners can vote. None of the new states that were added later had that. Property ownership was so, property in the form of real estate mostly. It was so common, it was kind of a distinction without a difference. And since there's a population drain from the east to the west, by the 1820s, all but a few, by 1828, all the states except South Carolina had set it up where they do away with the property qualification. Some of them substituted poll tax to keep the very dirt poorest men from voting, but this has the cumulative effect of roughly doubling the number of men who are eligible to vote. And since in the original states, if you're a voter, you walk a little taller and talk a little louder. You vote, just make sure everybody notices you're there, have that status. Okay, so you have that, you're multiplying the electorate. Another thing is that, and this goes almost all the way back, who chooses the electors? Originally, in most, if not all states, the state legislature chose the electors, just like they would choose senators until less than barely 100 years ago. So, in the 1790s, sometimes the state would switch back and forth between one election and the next. But by the 1820s, I think only South Carolina still had the legislature choosing the electors. So what have you done here? You've magnified the number of men who can vote, and you have given them access to the process whereby the president and vice president are chosen. You think that could bring some changes? Just maybe, okay. So this is a movement away from seeing the system as a republic and more towards seeing it functioning as a democracy. This brings us to the great screwed up election of 1824. To begin with, in 1820, President James Monroe was re-elected without opposition. And by the way, in party politics and an open system, 1 equals 0. Unlike arithmetic, why would you have a baseball team if there are no other teams out there for it to play games against? One political party has nothing to hold it together. It really has no function. So in 1820, as I say, the era of good feelings, it's a timeout from partisan politics. Now, One of the electors in 1820 realized that James Monroe was about to be unanimously elected by the Electoral College. He thought, you know what, that honor should belong to Washington alone. So one of the electors voted for John Quincy Adams instead, just to keep it from being unanimous. It's not like he was an opposing candidate. Now, we come to 1824, there's still nominally just one political party. The Congressional Caucus met, with not very many there, and they chose a very distinguished Georgian named William H. Crawford as the official nominee of the only political party. You'd think he'd have a good chance, right? Even though he was recovering from a stroke he had suffered. Okay. Now, it ends up being a four-man race, all within one political party. Okay. Can you spell screwed up? Up in New England, political operatives approached Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and got his permission to support his candidacy for president. That's how you did it, okay? And the culture of that time, a president must be a statesman. He must stand aloof and wait his country's call. You don't go grubbing for votes. If you want to be president, your minions do that. You can't even get up on a tree stump and say, oh, me, I want to be your president. You don't do that. So you have Adams ends up being the northern candidate. Crawford is the southern candidate out west. You have Henry Clay of Kentucky, and he emerges as the western candidate. These men all knew each other. They all respected each other. They'd all been to college. And stopping there, we're not quite through with the list yet. You have North versus South versus West. So here's the key thing about that election and what makes it unique. It is not a partisan election where one party's nominee goes up against another party's nominee. There's just one political party. So it's a sectional election. Okay? Does that bode well for the future of the Union? I would say not. And I'll explain why later. There is a wild card here. General Andrew Jackson, extremely popular. Southerners and Westerners particularly practically worship him as a god. He's in the race as well. The other three candidates did not take him seriously. He hadn't been to college. His only experience in national politics had been as a brief stint as a Tennessee senator back in the 1790s. And the fact he's popular meant nothing. In a republic, popularity doesn't matter. Okay? It had never before been a factor in a presidential campaign, or at least it's recognized as such. Washington was very popular. Okay. So the result then was a big shock to just about everybody. Matt? You know what, one more thing before we get to that. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina thought about getting into the presidential game, but the pool's kind of crowded, so he did something that's never been done before or since. He ran for vice president, unopposed, and he won. If it had been a partisan election, he would have had vice presidential nominees, but you didn't, because it's not a partisan election. Okay, so here we are. Jackson finished well ahead of the other three. The Electoral College, he has 99 votes. Adams has 84, it's fairly close. Crawford, 41, even though he's recovering from a stroke. And Henry Clay, 34, fairly close together. Clay saw it coming. Nobody's going to get a majority here. I'm the Speaker of the House. The House will make the choice. I'll get them to elect me. Didn't work out because he finished fourth. After the 12th Amendment, House only picks from the top three. So what's happened here? Jackson has got very deeply into Crawford's southern support and Clay's western support. He has not put a glove on Adams in the north. The popular vote. If you look up the tables at the back of the book, you'll find this is the first election where we have a national popular vote total. First one. It's only then were there enough states doing that. And even so, there were just 350 some odd thousand votes. Jackson got about 153,000, Adams 108,000, and the other two were under 50,000 each. But Jackson does not have a majority in the Electoral College. Consequently, the Constitution uses the word immediately. The House of Representatives, presided over by disappointed fourth place finisher Henry Clay, is going to have to hold a contingent election and choose somebody from the top three. Now Crawford, there are concerns about his health, and he's a very weak, far back in the pack. It's gonna be between Jackson and Adams. Now, Clay and Adams were not buddies, but Clay and Adams were not buddies. Clay and Jackson, their issues going way, way back, they hated the ground each other walked on and the air each other breathed. So Clay met with Adams. They might have just had a brewski. We don't know. We don't know what was promised or what it was, but it had the appearance because Clay, through his very serious political support behind Adams, and Adams was chosen to be the 6th president, even though he finished second in both the popular and electoral vote. Does that stink to high heaven or what? That's bad enough, but then a few days later, President-elect Adams appointed Henry Clay to be the Secretary of State. Secretary of State, okay. But in those days, Secretary of State was the unofficial on-deck circle for the presidency. Adams had been Monroe's Secretary of State. We're going backward here. Monroe had been Madison's Secretary of State. Madison had been Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Jefferson had been the first Secretary of State in the Washington administration. So, I'll give it to you now, you give it to me later. That's the way it looked. That is what they termed the corrupt bargain. There's a massive outrage over that. That's the corrupt bargain. So, make sure I'm on the right track here. Jackson's supporters went to work immediately to try to discredit Adams every way they could, see to it that he had an unsuccessful presidency, and Adams, who was far out of touch and politically inept, actually helped them with that in some ways, unwittingly. So the macro outcome here, two things. One, it made democracy itself a front burner political issue going forward. How democratic was our system? How democratic should it be? Democracy was in the spotlight. The 1828 election, which was an automatic rematch between Jackson and Adams, is going to be about democracy. Another thing was that the outrage led eventually over the next decade or so to the emergence of a new two-party political system. They both claimed the Republican label. They took names by the early 1830s, and Jackson's supporters resurrected the old Democratic Republican label for a while, and then they shortened it to just Democratic. This is the beginning of the Democratic Party. It still exists. A New York political operative named Martin Van Buren seems to have observed the dangers, the long-term dangers of sectional elections, so he switched his allegiance from Adams to Jackson, because Jackson's always going to be controversial. You love him or hate him, he's the kind of man you could build a new two-party system on. Get the ones that like him over here, and the ones that don't like him are going to organize the other way, and there's some issues behind that as well. The ones that supported Adams and the more conservative viewpoint became the National Republicans. Okay, Jackson easily won election in 1828, served 2 terms fraught with controversy. He enlarged presidential power in ways that seemed alarming. His use of the veto power, for example. The first 5 or 6 presidents in 40 years had only vetoed 10 bills. In 40 years, Jackson vetoed 12 in 8 years, including some just because he didn't like them. Before, it was an unwritten rule that you only vetoed legislation if you could show that it was unconstitutional in some way. That was supposed to be the filter for constitutionality. Yeah, right, that worked out. So there was that, and the Whigs thought that Jackson was behaving like a monarch. So they kind of gradually adopted the name of of an English political party calling itself the Whigs, W-H-I-G, not Whigs, Whigs. And that word used to carry enormous political freight that very few people have ever heard of today, but the English political party that thought the king should play a figurehead role were the Whigs. The one that thought the king should play an active role were called the Tories. Okay? The Tory party still exists. It became the Conservative Party in 1830. Okay. So we get a new two-party system. Here from the 1830s to the early 1850s. Presidential contests were between a Democratic nominee and a Whig nominee. The Democrats won in 1836. Jackson saw to it that his vice president, Martin Van Buren, would succeed him, and Martin Van Buren inherited all of Jackson's enemies, but few of his friends. Successful again. There was a financial crash in 1837, and if a president ever caused one, Jackson caused that one. But he was out of office by then, so his successor not to blame. Anyway, the Whigs won in 1840, with a Jackson look-alike who only lived a month after being sworn in. And then in 1844, the Democrats won. 1848, the Whigs won again. Both the presidents they managed to elect died in office. Such bad luck. In 1852, the Democrat, Franklin Pierce, badly defeated the Whig nominee, Winfield Scott. And the Whigs, like the Federalists before them, just faded off the political scene. By that time, sectional issues, North versus South issues, largely relating to the question of whether slavery would be extended into lands we just acquired from Mexico. Even the Whigs couldn't agree on that. All the Whigs ever really agreed on was they want to beat the Democrats. Really. A contemporary referred to the Whigs as an organized incompatibility. Really, true. So there were no more Whig nominees. Meanwhile, in 1854, an extremely controversial bill came up in Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the problem with it was that it was going to repeal the Missouri Compromise and allow slavery to extend west of the Mississippi, contrary to previous law. And so a brand new political party erupted just almost overnight in the summer of 1854 to do battle against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. If Homer had been describing it, he would have said they sprang from the earth full formed and armed for battle. It was called the Republican Party. It does still exist. Its goal was to prevent the extension of slavery. Later its goal became the elimination of slavery. They succeeded in both, but it got messy. They started in 1854. In 1856, they elected a Speaker of the House. Let's get in there in a hurry. They scooped up former Whigs. They scooped up a lot of Northern Democrats in national politics that weakened the Northern Democrats relative to the Southern Democrats who took control of the Democratic Party. There was a brief, short-lived third party, an anti-immigrant party known as the Know Nothings. They tended to gravitate to the Republicans as well. In 1856, so we're down to one party. The Republicans are national, they're major without being national, effectively a sectional party. Right? All right. 1856, the Northern and Southern Democrats held the show together one last time, electing an elderly Pennsylvanian named James Buchanan. What made him electable was simply that he'd been out of the country serving as a diplomat for several years and had no statements on the record about the controversial issues of the day. He would preside over a breakup of the union. So, then in 1860, the Democratic Party also broke up, splitting into Northern and Southern wings. They tried twice to have a convention. They couldn't get anywhere. The Northern Democrats favored Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. The Southern Democrats spurred a man named John Breckinridge from, I believe, Kentucky. So you get, it's not quite 1824, but it's a sectional thing. But it's two parts of the elections, Lincoln versus Douglas in the North. Breckinridge versus a Tennessean named John Bell, who led the so-called Constitutional Union Party. Two elections. Abraham Lincoln's Republican nominee, he wasn't even on the ballot in 11 southern states. But Douglas saw what was about to happen, and Douglas he broke with tradition. He went around making speeches, pleading with Southerners to stay in the Union even if Lincoln won. Trying to save the Union, trying to clean up a mess that he, more than any other individual politician, had caused. It didn't work. Okay, Lincoln got only 38% of the popular vote, but he swept the North's electoral votes and was chosen to be the 16th president. The Union, see, we've had The parties have functioned, this is important, as bonds of union. As long as Northern and Southern Democrats have got to be able to resolve their differences if they're going to win the presidential election, and Western as well, that will hold the union together. As long as Northern and Southern Whigs, as long as they lasted, had to do that. But now in 1860, you've just got a Northern Republican Party that's just up here, and the Democrats are split. So Lincoln gets elected, and the Union begins to come unraveled within weeks. South Carolina, in December 1860, adopted a resolution declaring that they were basically de-ratifying the Constitution, technically. They proclaimed that they were no longer a part of the federal union. By the time Lincoln was sworn in early March, 6 more southern states had followed, making a total thus far of 7 states which adopted a constitution which was the U.S. Constitution with protections of slavery written in, called themselves the Confederate States of America. And then Lincoln, about a month after he took office, South Carolina committed the blunder of going on offense, firing on a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston. Lincoln called up volunteers, signaling that he intended to wage war against the states that seceded. The legal case actually was fairly sound. But 4 more states went out, making a total of 11. I've always wondered, the Confederate flag has 13 stars, but there are only 11 Confederate states. So there you see it. We get the Civil War, the bloodiest war we have ever had. So the thing is, conclusion being, the election of 1824, the only purely sectional election we've ever had. If Jackson doesn't get in and there's not the smelly corrupt bargain, what if that had become the norm of having Northern, Southern and Western candidates? The United States would have become disunited sooner than it did. It quite likely would have resulted in permanent separation. The Democratic Party was severely wounded by what happened in the mid-19th century, and they had a really long drought between James Buchanan in 1856 and Franklin D. Roosevelt 76 years later in 1932. Only 2 Democrats won presidential elections. Grover Cleveland in 1884 and 1892 with another guy in between. Woodrow Wilson in 1912 and 1916. So there you have it. Any questions? Yes.
Do you think there was truly a corrupt bargain between Henry Clay?
It depended on where you stood. If you thought the country was a republic, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It was legal. It's not illegal. And the system has worked as devised. It is, but the obviously overwhelmingly better qualified men, well-educated, foreign experienced, diplomat, one of the best secretaries of state, really, we ever had. Put the best qualified man in office and has spared us the humiliation of having this semi-literate bumpkin from the West in the White House. If you thought of it as a democracy, this is the crime of the century. The men who got the most votes did not get it. And there are so many newly enfranchised voters out there, they can barely read. They're not up on the technicalities. They don't understand why their man was not in. So there you have it. Anything else? Does that answer your question?
Well, do you think there was a deal made? Let's put it that.
No, we'll never really know, but the appearance is there, and that's what matters. It's about appearances. Anything else? Yes.
Do you think what's currently happening in the Republican Party with the speaker race, which you alluded to earlier, do you think this is beginning to, will this be the fracturing of the party? Will we see another?
So.
No?
I really don't. No. That's something never been done before. It's a rule that's been there all along. I think any member can move to vacate the chair.
Sure. I'm just curious because you were talking about sort of this cult of personality and how it drives the party. I'm wondering if you're seeing this as people that are supportive of one candidate and against them, or
well, it's messy. The deal, I think, was that you took McCarthy some bunch of ballots to get in.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's a conservative wing that's fairly small, so-called Freedom Caucus, and they understand, they understand something I certainly agree with. We can't just go on inventing billions and trillions of dollars out of clear blue sky. without, it's like you're an airline pilot, you push the throttles all the way forward, put the control room all over, just boom, nose in, which then you can have socialism. Oh yeah, that'll work. So we just can't keep doing that with storing up breath. So, and McCarthy, they thought, had not kept his side of the bargain.
Do you think Republicans will unite though? That's the gist of it, yeah.
But for the Democrats, they've got defections to the left and the right. And not that stellar a record, I must admit. Anything else?
Is there a comparison between what would be considered a corrupt bargain and the perceived deal between Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford?
I don't know. I remember when that happened.
Oh, so do I.
Outrage. I didn't think at the time that such a thing would have happened. I don't know what you would prosecute Nixon for, being unpopular, I guess. About it. Truman left office with lower approval ratings than Nixon ever got. It's down in the 20s. It's hard to say, exactly what crime would have been involved there that he would be pardoned from. But as we've seen now, that you can be the target of investigations in search of a crime. If we're going to get this guy, we'll find something, and that's what happens in dictatorships. It's not what should happen in a country like ours. But again, I really don't know enough about the behind-the-scenes details there. And at the time, I don't remember hearing anybody speculating about a deal between Ford and Nixon. Anything else? Well, thank you for your kind attention, and we'll see you.